Saturday, April 28th, 2018, Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today I'm going to talk about GDP, the measure that is always used by governments, by central banks, by mainstream economists to show you how the economy is doing really well. And the reason I'm going to talk about GDP today is that the GDP data for the UK came out yesterday for the first quarter of 2018. And it was a dismal figure, but I will also show you by looking at how GDP is calculated, why it's even worse than we're being told. So first of all, let's have a look at the data. Well, the GDP data for the first quarter in the UK was expected to rise by 0.3%. That's quarter on quarter. Year on year, the figures was expected to rise by 1.4%. That's comparing it to the first quarter of 2017. So the number actually came out at 0.1 quarter on quarter, and it came out at 1.2 year on year. So a lot worse than expected. The British pound dropped about 1% against the dollar. It had a really bad day, and it's not surprising. And now we've got stories like this. Bank of England spoke too fast. The bank put on the brakes without first checking the pickup was real. So it goes to say here, this is from Bloomberg. I got this from Bloomberg. Last November, the Bank of England raised interest rates for the first time in a decade and then warned there could be more increases to come. The economy was faring better than expected after the Brexit vote. Inflation was well above the bank's 2% target after depreciation of sterling had pushed up import prices. Officials believe price pressures had to be brought under control. It goes on to say reality returned out somewhat differently. On Friday, the data showed that the British economy slowed sharply in the first 3 months of this year, growing by just 0.1%. And I would argue that number is even being probably they've squeezed out as much as they can to make it look positive. In reality, it was probably even less than zero. Of course, I have no proof for that. So now I'd like to look at why I think the UK GDP, and you can do this exercise for the US GDP, for any other country's GDP. I'll show you why I think it's even worse, this number. All right, I've gone to Wikipedia and I've gone to the gross domestic product. So this is the equation. Components of GDP expenditure. So this is how you calculate GDP. GDP is the sum of consumption, investment, government spending. Keep that in mind, G. And net exports, exports minus imports. So GDP, so when you add all these, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, you get GDP. So what about government spending? Well, they put on all the government spending in there. But what if the government spends more than it takes in? What if the government has a deficit like it's had in the UK since the great financial crisis of 07-08, like the US has had? So look at this chart here. We go back to 2008, the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP. Look how it spiked after the crisis from below 3%, and it's been above 5% most of the time since the financial crisis. The latest data for this year, the GDP is at the budget deficit is at 2% of GDP. So that means that the government is spending 2% extra of GDP, and it's having to borrow that. It's not taking that from the economy. It's not taking it from taxation. It's taking it from borrowing. So if you, for example, take that data, the 2% deficit, or 2.2, and you subtract that from the 1.2% we got yesterday, year-on-year of GDP, you actually get a minus 1% growth rate. And you look at all the years before, since the crisis, they were a lot higher, these numbers. GDP was nowhere near those deficits. So if it wasn't for the government borrowing and for the government spending beyond its means, we have negative GDP. We are really in the recession. And why is that? Well, I would argue it's because of all the money we had to borrow to save the banks in 2008, 2009, to save the system, and also to save the housing market. There's a lot of talk, blame for the housing market, why rents are so high, why prices are, people can't afford them. Well, it's because the bailout of the system was to keep the banks solvent. Around 2/3 of the bank's balance sheets are loans on mortgages and housing and property, and they had to keep it up. And that's why we have a problem of unaffordability. It's not because of immigrants. It's not because of a housing shortage. It's none of that. And Brexit has nothing to do with why the pound is weaker or why the economy isn't picking up. The reason we are in a depression, really, in the UK, and only the city of London is doing well, and maybe some of the housing sectors, is because the government, and I put both parties in this because it was under Labour's watch that the system collapsed. Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling, they bailed everything out, and the Tories kept going, bailing everyone out, all the banks. And there's an interesting article here in The Guardian. I don't read The Guardian, but you kind of find some of these articles. And this is from 2011. And it says here, reality check. How much did the banking crisis cost the taxpayers? So one thing I can tell you is that it's very uncertain. They don't seem to know. So the question is, how much did the banking crisis cost the UK taxpayer? And it goes on to say, last December, the National Audit Office published a second report into the costs of the bailout. That report concluded, the scale of the support currently provided to UK banks has fallen from a peak of 955 billion, yes, 955 billion, to 512 billion. But the amount of cash currently borrowed by the government to support banks has risen by 7 billion. To a total of 124 billion since 2009. This is another interesting point that this Guardian story makes. It says, the initial response from the Treasury to our question was that the bailout would cost nothing because the banks will pay the money back, but asked when that was likely to happen they acknowledged that in the cases of Northern Rock and Bradford and Bingley, this time spent could be 20 years or longer, as it depends on people paying off their mortgages. Even The Guardian, which is a mainstream left-wing publication, they can't get an answer to how much really has been used to bail out the banks. But in terms of debt, before the crisis, we had 500 billion of the government national debt. Now, according to official figures, we've got about 1.8 trillion. Some people think it's more like 2 trillion. I would say it's probably even more, and we don't know. And the Treasury won't tell us how much really the banks have been bailed out by. So, and the other interesting point I'd like to make is to show you this chart here. This is from the World Bank, and it's actually public data on Google, and it's the gross domestic product of the UK in US dollar terms. And you can see that it topped at over 3 trillion in 2007. And right now, if you look at Wikipedia, Economy of the UK, the last data for UK GDP is $2.6 trillion, which is just around 2 trillion pounds now at the present exchange rate. So, and if our debt is around 2 trillion or even more, that means it's 100% of GDP. Government says it's more like 87%. I personally don't believe them. The Treasury is not really being transparent. And don't take my word for it. Take the Guardian's word for it. So that's how well the UK economy has done since 2008. I would say it's a lost decade and we are in a depression. And that's why there's so much dissatisfaction with the establishment and the elite, the City of London, which I spoke of the other day in a video. And yes, it's amazing. So that's the true story. Will you hear that in the mainstream media? No, the mainstream media, I saw one article yesterday. They said, yeah, GDP was weaker than expected. And then they brought up the weather because it was cold. And at the same time, they said, oh, but most analysts don't think it had a huge impact. But they make you think about it. It's got nothing to do with the weather. It's all to do with the debt. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is to let the system come down. Stop supporting the banks. Stop bailing them out. Yes, it's going to hurt. Of course, no one in the UK who owns property, who's done well from the crisis, wants that. But for the millions of young people and even older people now that can't afford to live, they can't afford to rent, they can't afford to buy a property, this is the result of this policy. Because if they let the banks go, if they let the housing market go, the whole system goes. As I said, UK GDP, I don't think is going to get any better. Should they raise rates? Well, of course, they should have let the market do all the work, but they've manipulated everything for the last 10 years. They've kept interest rates artificially low because they have to keep the housing market from collapsing. They've had to keep the City of London going at the expense, and all the debt that we've the debt has gone up like 400%, from 500 billion to 2 trillion plus, I would say even more. And who's lumbered with this debt? The general public is, the taxpayer. And what's this? All this debt being created to keep the banks going, so the banks can take the money we lent to them and lend it back to us. That's why I say you need to get out of debt and not play their games, because it enslaves people. And so GDP hasn't grown in real terms, or the private economy, for years. The UK is in a Great Depression, and that's what and that's it. Those are facts. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, share it, subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. You can also follow me on Steemit and DTube and on Twitter. And don't forget to click on the little bell above. You'll get notified of my new videos. I'll talk to you later. Have a great weekend. Take care. Bye.